Picture this. You're a map maker in 1916, carefully inking the borders of the largest empire on Earth. The Russian Empire stretches from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing 1/6 of the world's land surface. Your steady hand traces lines that have stood for centuries, connecting Finnish forests to Siberian tundra, Polish farmlands to Central Asian steppes. But here's the thing about maps, they're only as permanent as the people who draw them. Within 5 short years, your masterpiece would become obsolete. Not because of some gradual diplomatic shuffling, but because a revolution would tear through this vast empire like a wildfire through dry wheat. The Russian Revolution didn't just change a government, it shattered the world's largest country into pieces, created new nations overnight, and redrew the very concept of what a map could be. Tonight, we're going to watch the world transform, one border at a time. The story begins not with grand proclamations or dramatic speeches, but with something far more human: hunger. By 1917, Russian soldiers were eating bark soup and civilians queued for hours just to buy a loaf of bread that cost more than their weekly wages. Tsar Nicholas II, bless his oblivious heart, was more concerned with his son's hemophilia than the fact that his empire was literally falling apart at the seams. When revolution finally came in February, it arrived not with fanfare but with the quiet desperation of people who simply couldn't take another day of the same suffering. But here's where our story gets interesting and messy. The February Revolution was like the first crack in a massive dam. Once Nicholas abdicated, the provisional government tried to hold everything together with the political equivalent of duct tape and wishful thinking. Meanwhile, Lenin, that persistent revolutionary who'd been lurking in Swiss exile, saw his moment and took it. His October coup wasn't just a change of government, it was a complete reimagining of what Russia could be. Lenin's new Bolshevik government faced a problem that would make any cartographer weep. How do you govern an empire when half of it doesn't want to be governed by you? The answer, as it turned out, was that you don't. Almost immediately, pieces of the Russian Empire began declaring independence like dominoes falling in slow motion. Finland, those practical Scandinavians, were among the first to slip away in December 1917. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania followed suit, finally free from centuries of Russian rule. Poland, which had been carved up and absorbed by various empires more times than anyone cared to count, suddenly found itself independent again after 123 years of partition. Ukrainian nationalists proclaimed their own state, though they'd spend the next few years fighting everyone from Germans to whites to reds to figure out exactly what that meant. In the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan declared independence, creating a patchwork of new nations in the mountainous region between Europe and Asia. The chaos was breathtaking in its scope. Picture trying to redraw a map while the ground beneath your feet is shifting. The Russian Civil War that followed turned the former empire into a battlefield where geography became fluid. One week a city might be controlled by the Red Army, the next by the White Forces, and the week after that by some local warlord who decided to try his hand at nation building. But Lenin and his Bolsheviks were pragmatists beneath all that revolutionary rhetoric. When faced with the choice between ideology and survival, they chose survival. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918 saw them surrender massive chunks of territory to Germany, Poland, the Baltics, Ukraine, and more. It was a devastating blow to Russian pride, but it bought them the peace they needed to consolidate power. Here's the irony that would make even the most stoic historian chuckle. Many of these newly independent nations didn't stay independent for long. When Germany collapsed in November 1918, the Bolsheviks began the slow, bloody process of reassembling their empire, though they called it something different now. Ukraine was reconquered by 1922. Georgia fell in 1921 after a brief but fierce resistance. The Baltic states managed to maintain their independence, but they lived under the constant shadow of their massive neighbor. By 1922, when the Soviet Union was officially proclaimed, the map looked dramatically different from the old Russian Empire. What had once been a single, sprawling autocracy was now a federation of Soviet republics, at least in theory. In practice, it was still a highly centralized state, but one that had learned to disguise its imperial nature behind the language of socialist brotherhood. The human cost of this geographic reshuffling was staggering. Millions died in the revolution, the Civil War, and the chaos that followed. Families were separated by new borders that appeared overnight. Ethnic Germans who had lived in Russia for centuries suddenly found themselves unwelcome. Jewish communities faced pogroms from all sides. The Cossacks, those legendary horsemen of the steppes, saw their traditional way of life destroyed forever. And so, in the span of just 5 years, the world's largest empire dissolved and reformed itself into something entirely new. The Russian Revolution didn't just change Russia, it created Finland, reborn Poland, independent Baltic states, and briefly, a dozen other nations that flickered into existence like candles in a storm. Some of these borders would prove more durable than others, but all of them reflected a fundamental truth. Empires are not eternal, and maps are only as permanent as the people who believe in them. The next time you look at a world map, remember this moment when a revolution literally redrew the world. Those neat, clean lines that seem so permanent today were once as fluid as watercolors in the rain, shaped by ordinary people making extraordinary choices in impossible times.